They had no flag, no anthem, and no formal declaration. And yet, a single word assassin was enough to make kings wake in fear. For over 150 years, they moved like shadows, striking without warning, vanishing without a trace. They were called many names: the Nazari, Thismaelis, and the Hashashin. That last word, echoing like a curse, became forever tied to blood, darkness, and secrets history still hasn't fully uncovered. Who were they? Why did they kill? And why, even today, can history still not explain their existence? Welcome to Bedtime History. Tonight, we journey into the story of one of the most mysterious organizations in human history, not just to revisit their assassinations, but to explore the silence they left behind. So relax, close your eyes, and let history whisper to you. While great empires battled over every stretch of land and every flicker of loyalty, in a remote and rugged corner of Persia's Alborz Mountains, a small group quietly built a power of their own. They had no nation, no vast army, but they possessed something no dynasty recognized: the most dangerous weapon of all, the power to plant fear deep within the enemy's heart. The founder of this order was Hassanai Sabah scholar, a strategist, and a man cast out by the dominant religious powers of his day. He wasn't a prophet, nor did he dream of building an empire by conquest. Instead, he chose wisdom, patience, and calculated strategy as the foundation of his movement. At Alamot Fortrissa stronghold, he seized, not with force, but with cunning and conviction. He began training men who would one day reshape history. No one knows exactly what went on behind those walls, but survivors of the assassinations described the killers as unlike any men they had seen: calm, silent, and unshakable. They did not flee. They showed no fear of death. And that, more than the killing itself, is what terrified the rulers of the time. Not that they were dying, but that someone could kill with such peace in their eyes. In a world where power was measured by armies, borders, and blood, the assassins needed only a single blade and a soul willing to die to alter the political landscape. They didn't fight a nation, they fought a system where only the strong decided who lived and who perished. Hassanai Sabah understood they couldn't win in open war. They had to become invisible, let the fear do the damage. This wasn't just a tactic, it was a philosophy. Inside Alamut, loyalty wasn't blind. Those chosen to become Fidavos, ready to sacrifice themselves, were trained not just in the art of killing, but also in philosophy, theology, and strategic thinking. They were not simply assassins. They were living instruments of conviction. They sought no reward, no fame. They left nothing behind but the corpse of a target. That's what made them so terrifying. No one could predict who they were, where they came from, or who they would strike next. Anyone could be a target. No one was too powerful. That was the brilliance of their strategy, planting fear in the hearts of the powerful until they weakened themselves under the weight of their own paranoia. What's often forgotten is that the Hashashin were not merely shadowy killers as legends paint them. They followed a complex philosophy. They believed they were resisting oppression not through brute strength, but through intellect and sacrifice. But history is rarely kind to those who defy its order. Rather than being remembered as thinkers and revolutionaries, they were reduced to a slur. Hashashin users of hashisha, label meant to mock their faith, distort their purpose, and erase their ideals. Yet the legacy endures. A small group with Normi and Narration made an entire region afraid to sleep. And even as Alamut now lies in ruins, the questions remain unanswered. The fear they sowed, the memory of it has never died. The fortress of Alamut wasn't built from stone alone. It was built from the silent conviction of those who believed the world could be changed. Not through swords, but through belief. Perched high on a cliff in the Alborz Mountains, Alamut stood at the edge of the known and the forbidden. It was impenetrable, both physically and ideologically. Once inside, few ever truly left. Alamut became a stronghold of strategy, a haven for radical thought, and the beating heart of a hidden force the world still cannot decipher. No outsider truly knew what went on within its walls, but fragmented stories from survivors painted a picture both mysterious and profound. Young recruits, some as young as 15, were not taught simply how to kill. They were taught why they must be ready to die. They studied philosophy, theology, strategy, and cryptography. They weren't ruled by fear or force, but by belief, by the idea that the world was under false rule, and only sacrifice could dismantle that illusion. There are legends that Hassan I-Subba created a false paradise within Alamata, place of overwhelming pleasure. After letting young recruits taste it, he would return them to the fortress and tell them, "This is what awaits those who are loyal." Whether or not the tale is literal, its meaning is clear. This wasn't about controlling action, it was about mastering belief. Once a man believed death brought reward, fear had no hold over him. Assassins learned how to blend in, posing as beggars, pilgrims, servants, and even the disabled. They didn't use grand weapons, a hidden dagger, a poisoned needle, one strike to the heart. That's all it took to end the life of a king. But their mission wasn't just to kill, it was to send a message. No matter how powerful you are, there is an invisible hand that can reach your throat. And that was what made them impossible to fight. Every time a figure of power died surrounded by guards, in a crowd, or inside a sacred space, no one could explain how. No one saw them arrive. No one saw them leave. Only the shadow remained, and paranoia grew. Judges, governors, clerics, generals, no one was safe. And because they had no state, normie, and no visible force to target, they couldn't be destroyed. To the outside world, they were fanatics. Fanatics under the illusion of paradise. But to themselves, they were FIDB. Those who sacrificed, not for glory, not for pleasure, but to protect a truth the world refused to acknowledge. Within Alamate's halls, they turned loyalty into a weapon. There were no drums of war, no declarations, no mass invasions. And yet, when a nobleman collapsed, in a crowd, blood pouring from his chest, struck down in a mosque or at court, entire kingdoms trembled. The killer's name was never known. His footprints were never found. But one phrase spread like wildfire. The men of Alamut have acted. One of the most devastating examples was the assassination of Nizam ul-Mulk, Grand Vizier of the Seljuk Empire. A brilliant statesman, the founder of the madrasa system, and the fiercest enemy of the Ismailis. In 1092, while on pilgrimage, he was approached by a man posing as a wandering mystic. With a single precise strike, he was killed instantly. The assassin was cut down moments later, but the message had been delivered. The motive was clear. He had come from Alamut. This wasn't just revenge, it was strategy. Nizam's death struck at the heart of Seljuk authority. It destabilized the empire and created openings the Ismailis used to survive and expand. That moment was a lesson for every ruler who followed. In the right hands, a single dagger could shake an empire. And in the years that followed, more would fall governors, judges, commanders, all victims of the same invisible force. Even more terrifying than the killings themselves was the boldness with which they were carried out. These weren't murders committed in the shadows, they unfolded in broad daylight, in full view of stunned witnesses. It was deliberate. It was a message. From Persia to Syria, the name Hashin began to travel faster than any army ever could. A whisper turned to dread. The assassins were no longer just feared. They were believed to be unstoppable. Their targets were men of power, preachers, governors, and kings. Some were stabbed in the middle of private meetings, surrounded by their most trusted advisors. Others collapsed at the gates of mosques, encircled by thousands. And yet, no one saw the killer arrive. That was the point. Not even sacred ground could shield you. One of the most shocking acts was the assassination of Conrad of Montferrat, a powerful Christian noble during the Crusades. In 1192, just days after being elected King of Jerusalem, he was stabbed in the street by two men. But they didn't flee. They stood still, accepted their execution. And again, all trails led to one place: Alamant. Over time, something even stranger happened. Rulers began sending gifts, letters, and even secret treaties to Alamant, not to ally, but to survive. Safety became something you negotiated. When you couldn't kill the enemy, you paid to be ignored. This made the assassins more than a terror network. They were a hidden political force, capable of shaping royal successions, altering alliances, and appointing power from behind the curtain. The world had to confront a horrifying truth. When death could come at the hands of a nameless stranger, when no wall or priest could shield you, power meant nothing. That was the assassin's true weapon, not blades, but fear. They didn't need armies. They controlled the minds of the powerful. Over time, even saying their name became taboo. They were ghosts now. A silent dread inside every palace and cathedral. Those who defied the Ismaili cause knew exactly what fate awaited them, not because they were weak, but because they understood the assassin's game. The blade was never far, and it always struck from behind. What terrified rulers most wasn't death, it was not knowing where the killer was or who he might be. This was where the assassins outmatched every enemy. With no army, no navy, and no banners, their word could still sweep across the Middle East in days. A name scrawled on parchment, a kill order that left no trail. The order's power wasn't in numbers, but in invisibility. No one truly knows how they communicated. There were no birds, no visible couriers. Yet stories tell of messages passed by a glance, a phrase, or a symbol placed with eerie precision. Commands crossed deserts, mountains, and borders, arriving exactly when and where they were meant to. It was a language of shadows, symbolic and untraceable. The signs were simple: a dagger wedged into a doorframe, a coin etched with a tower, a strip of cloth tied to a branch. To outsiders, meaningless. But to a Fidei, they were instructions, warnings, or proof that they were not alone in this invisible war. One of the most disturbing things, the assassins left almost no writings, no manifestos, no open declarations. And when they did write, it was in verses, metaphors, or encrypted Quranic passages. That's why historians still struggle, because the evidence is there but buried in so many layers of meaning. No one can separate fact from myth. Inside the order, the hierarchy was ruthless in its secrecy. Recruits knew only what they needed know. Questions asked. Higher ranks might learn names, places, and methods. but only a chosen few near Hassan Seba ever saw the full picture. These few could authorize the death of a vizier or cancel a king's execution. That tight structure made the order nearly impenetrable. If a Fidai was captured, he couldn't reveal secrets he didn't know them. He was one link in a long, concealed chain. Even the mighty Seljuk Empire tried sending spies into Alamut. Some disappeared. Others returned broken, unable to speak about what they had or hadn't seen. No letters, no broadcasts, yet every Fidai knew exactly when to move, where to strike, and what to say, as if guided by a sixth sense. Some scholars now believe the order functioned like a living organism. Each assassin acted independently, but moved with the purpose of a shared mind. No one has ever proven it, but the fact they survived nearly 2 centuries without a single internal betrayal is proof enough. Something extraordinary was at work. And here's what makes the mystery deeper: no Fidai ever defected. No assassin was captured and revealed their inner workings. Was it fear? Maybe. But perhaps it was something more profound. Perhaps they truly believed in what they served. That death was not a defeat, but a fulfillment. A sacred ending to a life of purpose. This made the assassins terrifying in a way no empire could match. They didn't simply disappear from the sight of their enemies. They disappeared into the souls of those who followed them. There was no center to strike, no throne to target, but the assassins could strike anywhere, anytime, without warning, without sound. Of all the secrets surrounding the order, one stunned the outside world more than any. The way the Fidai embraced death. They didn't ask for mercy. They didn't flee. One strike, one glance, and then they accepted their execution, with calm silence, as if death were the final sacred step in their journey. Why would anyone do that? The answer wasn't in their training. It lay deeper in belief. The Fidai weren't merely taught how to kill. They were taught why. And once that reason surpassed, the self, death, lost its power to terrify. Their Ismaili faith was different from the dominant Islam of their time. It spoke of hidden truths passed through a secret line of imams. Hassan Seba was more than a leader. He was a torchbearer of that sacred knowledge. And Alamut wasn't just a fortress. It was a sanctuary of thought, a place where faith and purpose fused into something larger than life. To the Fidai, the world was not just a battlefield. It was a stage for cosmic justice. Every tyrant they killed was a link broken from a chain of oppression stretching through history. And when they died, they believed they returned not to dust but to light, to eternity. There are records, half-whispered, half-legend, of assassins fasting before a mission, spending nights in prayer, purifying themselves, not out of fear, but readiness. They didn't tremble, they didn't plead, they simply walked into their fate as if it had already been written. To them, death wasn't an end, it was the door. Some Western travelers, like Marco Polo, later told of false paradises shown to assassins, gardens of pleasure meant to seduce loyalty. Whether these tales were true or myth, they captured a deeper truth. These men believed in a world beyond this one, and only through sacrifice could they reach it. This belief, this terrifying certainty, was the assassin's greatest weapon. They didn't need to threaten. They didn't need to promise. They inspired a loyalty so complete, it burned away the instinct for survival. And when a man no longer fears death, he becomes the most dangerous force in existence. Not because of strength, but because no one knows what he fears. For empires built on wealth, armies, and fear, this was unthinkable. How do you fight a force that wants nothing? that cannot be bribed, threatened, or broken. How do you stop a man who welcomes death? That was the nightmare the assassins left behind. It wasn't just the bodies they claimed, it was the fear they planted in the minds of kings, generals, and popes. When rulers met in private chambers, they didn't only fear their enemies beyond the border. They feared something closer, a guard, a servant, a shadow. Was there a fidei among them? And if there was, what could they do except wait? He was surrounded by his most trusted guardsmen who had sworn loyalty with their lives. And yet, when the dagger came, it came not from the shadows but from beside him. The assassin was not a stranger. He was someone who had lived within those very walls for years. The question was never who did it was always, how long had he been here? Because for the assassins, presence mattered far less than timing. A fidei could move like a shadow, breathe like silence, and vanish like memory only, to appear once for a single strike that would alter the fate of kingdoms. These men were not mere killers. They were actors in an excruciatingly patient drama. Some rehearsed their roles for over a decade. They learnt the enemy's language. They lived as locals disguised as merchants, scribes, scholars, and servants. Some even became soldiers in the very armies they were meant to infiltrate. They didn't just mimic the enemy. They became the enemy, and then they waited. One harrowing tale speaks of a fidei who spent 13 years inside the Seljuk court. Over time, he rose in rank, earned trust, and was eventually granted command of a fortress in the king's name. Then one evening, while calmly sipping tea beside his target in a candlelit study, he reached into his sleeve and, with a single deliberate motion, plunged a dagger into the man's heart. He then sat back, composed, and waited for the guards to arrest him, smiling as they dragged him away. It wasn't rage. It wasn't impulse. It was the final act in a role he had rehearsed for over a decade. A performance so complete, it's possible he no longer knew where the character ended and his true self began. He wasn't just within the system. He was the system. And that made him unstoppable. Because there is no fortress high enough, no wall thick enough, to protect against an enemy who has already been welcomed inside. The assassins didn't need armies. They didn't need to win battles. They conquered through fear by eroding trust. When anyone could be an assassin, no one could be trusted. Kings doubted their viziers. Generals doubted their captains. Fathers doubted their sons. And in that silent collapse of certainty, the assassins had already won. They didn't have to strike again. The world tore itself apart in fear of a blade that might never come. Not every fidei was killed. Some infiltrated religious orders, posing as devout priests, imams, and monks. They studied doctrine, recited scripture, and even led sermons not to destroy, but to watch, to send word, to plant ideas like seeds in the soil of ideology, letting confusion and division grow over time. One scholar tells of debating a gifted clericonly to discover, years later, that the man had been a fidei all along. How does a man live to lives, walk to roads, without tearing his soul apart? The answer lies in belief, shakable, unrelenting. Belief, when every act is part of a divine plan, when every disguise is a sacrament, then there is no duality. The mission becomes the truth. The lie becomes the life. The assassins didn't need hundreds of warriors. They only needed one. Dagger in the right hand, at the right moment, wielded by someone no one would ever suspect. That was enough to topple thrones. That's why royal courts lived in a state of quiet dread. Because they never knew, was the man at the gate today a loyal guard, or a ghost who had waited 9 years. Was the servant pouring wine trained to kill since the age of 16? These were the questions without answers. And that was the assassin's most perfect victory, a war won without a battlefield, a terror that outlasted death. To the Western eye, the Crusades were a holy war, a divine mission to reclaim sacred lands. But on the ground, in the chaos of the 12th century Middle East, they were something else entirely. Betrayal, ambition, and endless bloodshed. Muslim kingdoms were fractured. Christian crusader states rose and fell like desert mirages. And somewhere, between both sides, there emerged a third, forceful, silent, and feared by all. The assassins. They had no banner, no standing army, no desire for territory, and yet their influence could bend empires. At first, the Crusaders didn't understand. To them, Islam was the enemy. But then their own leaders began, dying not in battle, but in the streets, in marketplaces, at weddings, during private dinners. The killers spoke their language, wore local clothes, carried a single dagger, and when caught they didn't plead, they didn't beg, they smiled. Conrad of Montferrat, elected king of Jerusalem, was assassinated in broad daylight. 2 men walked up to him in the street and stabbed him through the chest. They were captured immediately. One smiled before his execution and whispered a phrase in a language no one understood. But the word Alamot lingered. Fear spread. What terrified the Crusaders wasn't just the precision, it was the uncertainty. Why would a Muslim sect assassinate a Christian king who might have been an ally? Because the assassins didn't care about sides. Not Christian, not Muslim. They cared about threats. And in the tangled politics of the Crusades, they sometimes maintained balance through murder, other times through quiet negotiation. Records suggest that some Christian lords even sent envoys to Alamat, offering tribute in exchange for protection. They weren't soldiers. They were a force of equilibrium. One could not bribe them. One could not intimidate them. They answered to a code only they understood. A legend tells that Richard the Lionheart once sent a message to Hassan I Seba, demanding that he cease his attacks. Hassan didn't reply with words. He sent a dagger placed silently beside Richard's sleeping envoy. Attached was a note. If I wished it, this would be in your heart. No one knows if it's true, but no one forgot it. And that is where the assassins' true power lay. They didn't have to kill thousands to change history. They only had to kill a few and be seen. Because when you don't know who will die next, everyone becomes a suspect. In a war where both Christians and Muslims claimed to serve God, the assassins walked a different path. They burned no churches. They destroyed no mosques. They didn't preach salvation. They struck the right person at the right moment, and disappeared. That's why no side ever truly crushed them. The Crusaders lacked unity. The Muslim rulers feared reprisal. And so the assassins endured an invisible, third force, too small to conquer, too precise to destroy. And yet, in the official records, history remembers swords and crowns, but not whispers and silence. The women of the order are almost entirely absent from the chronicles. No names, no titles, no epic tales of missions. But that does not mean they weren't there. On the contrary, they were the pulse that kept the order alive. Inside the stone walls of Alamat, where no outsider ever walked, women nurtured, healed, educated, and trained the Fidei in secret archives. Later discovered, it is clear many women in the Ismaili community held deep knowledge of herbs, antidotes, poisons, and medicines. These were not side roles. These were essential. One legend tells of a female assassin who reached her target by marrying him living at his side for months before striking. No one suspected a woman. No one imagined those soft eyes hid death. That was her power. Apparent weakness perfectly performed. Some texts even hint that women at Alamat served as librarians, guardians of sacred texts, cartographers of secret maps, and protectors of hidden knowledge layered with esoteric meaning. Their role was not to kill but to preserve, to protect the soul of the order from annihilation. There's a legend of a woman so trusted by Hassan I-Subba that in his final years of spiritual retreat, he left her to make decisions in his name. She ruled from silence, and perhaps that is the true legacy of the assassins, not what they destroyed, but what they preserved, not just in blood, but in belief, not in noise, but in silence. She survives only in fragments, oral traditions, scattered mentions, and fading names, but her image is always the same. A woman who carried no dagger, yet chose who would live or die. While history often confines medieval women to kitchens, harems, or chapels, the assassin order was different. Here, women served as messengers, trainers, and codebreakers, perhaps even the unseen force behind a king's quiet death. They did not seek attention. They were the hidden structure of the spine in the shadows. Remarkably, unlike in many other societies of the time, women in the order were not treated as property. They were granted access to knowledge, trained in logic and critical thought, and entrusted with sacred secrets. This breaking of gender roles wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. It allowed the order to remain hidden, fluid, and unpredictable for nearly 2 centuries. When no one suspects a woman, she becomes the invisible thread holding everything together. Even today, descendants of the Ismaili tradition still speak of women as essential to the community. Individual names are rarely honored, but one truth is repeated. In darkness, nothing survives without the hand that keeps the flame alive. Perhaps during those long, silent years, when a FIDB was sent to kill, there were women nameless, faceless, who planned the mission, prepared every step, and waited, knowing they would never see their comrade again. Their sacrifice was never written down, but it is carved deep into the soul of the orderer. Soul history has yet to fully acknowledge. Alamot was never the grandest fortress. It had no vast moats, no towers bristling with cannon, and no army of thousands like the castles of medieval Europe. And yet, no siege against it ever succeeded. Not because of overwhelming force, but because no empire truly understood what Alamat was. Clinging to the jagged cliffs of Persia's Alborz mountains, Alamat was like a crack between heaven and earth. Only one narrow trail led to its gate, known only to those permitted to walk it. The terrain itself was treacherous enough to hold any invading army. A few hidden archers high above could stop thousands. But Alamot's true power wasn't in its defenses, it was in its mind, inside. According to rare accounts from Muslim historians, was a realm utterly unlike the world below. A labyrinth of philosophy, discipline, and spiritual rigor. Its thick stone walls held more than just bodies. They held ideas, rituals, and a kind of belief that turned men into living instruments of will. There were no torture chambers, no prisons, but there was intellectual discipline, harsh and exacting. No one knew the full truth. Each initiate was given only what they needed. One task, one mission, one fragment of belief. Death, should it come, was seen not as loss, but as transcendence. Alamet's library was its hidden jewel. Ancient sources speak of multiple copies of the Quran, mathematical treatises, works of astronomy, medicine, Greek philosophy, and even Indian texts. This wasn't a fortress, was a crucible, a place where knowledge was preserved and weaponized, where learning wasn't revered for tradition's sake, but retooled in service of a purpose few outside would ever comprehend. The scholars of Alamat didn't merely study theology, they dismantled it and analyzed it. Faith was not blind, it was sharpened. The Fayadi were not taught to believe. They were taught to understand why belief must lead to action, and why death could be embraced when it served a truth deeper than life itself. What kept Alamat standing for nearly 2 centuries wasn't its stone, but its silence. No one knew who lived there, trained there, or planned the next strike. No banners, no declarations, only shadows. The kind of silence that stretches over mountains, waiting to swallow anyone bold enough to break it. Alamat was besieged many times. None succeeded. Some armies turned back in doubt. Others lost men to unseen arrows. Those who entered without invitation often vanished entirely. Their bodies were never found, and in the end, it wasn't death people feared most. It was a disappearance, erasure. Alamat understood this better than anyone. When an empire reaches its height, it begins to believe it controls everything. Land, loyalty, law, even destiny. But those who faced the assassin order learned a darker truth. The worst kind of defeat isn't losing, it's not knowing what you're fighting. Medieval empires were built to fight armies, not ideas. But when the enemy wears coarse robes, speaks gently, and hides a dagger in his sleeve, no defense works. The assassin's first true enemy was the Seljuk Empire, vast Islamic power that spanned Persia and Central Asia, with its bureaucracy, elite armies, and reach from Baghdad to Syria. The Seljuks saw the Ismailis as dangerous heretics. Grand Vizier Nizam el-Malek once declared, "A tree cannot survive with worms in its roots." He saw the Ismailis as that worm. Ironically, he became their first great victim. During pilgrimage, surrounded by guards, he was approached by a man posing as a mystic. One dagger, one strike. Nizam fell. It was a shock. His death shattered Seljuk politics. It was a message. When the worm learns to wield a blade, the entire tree trembles. Soon after, Sultan Malik Shahu vowed to destroy Alamat's side, suddenly. There was no proof of assassination, but fear had already taken hold. Empires paused. Plans were shelved. Rumors replaced orders. Even crusader kings weren't spared. Conrad of Montferrat, elected king of Jerusalem, was stabbed in broad daylight by 2 strangers. A Christian king killed by a Muslim group. No one understood were the assassin's allies, enemies. That confusion, that inability to define them, was their most lethal weapon. But no empire lasts forever, and the one enemy the assassins couldn't defeat was one that feared nothing: the Mongol Empire. They didn't care for religion. They didn't negotiate. As they swept west, burning Baghdad, leveling cities, and destroying libraries, they turned their gaze to Alamat. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, led the assault personally. He brought Mongol siegecraft, matched and merciless. Alamat, for the first time in 200 years, faced something it had no answer for. An enemy that didn't fear death, didn't want alliances, and wasn't confused by silence. The fortress fell. There was no grand resistance, no final stand. As the Mongols approached, those who remained inside burned the library, destroyed the archives, and erased their own history. When the invaders breached the walls, they found no treasure, no scrolls, no ideology, only ash and silence. It was as if the fortress had chosen to vanish rather than be understood. And yet, despite the fall, the assassins were never truly destroyed. No army, no matter how vast, can kill an idea. The order may have lost its state, its fortress, and its leaders, but it lived on, in whispers, in sudden deaths, in mysteries left behind. Their enemies believed they had won, but sometimes, on a quiet night in the hills of Persia, you might still hear the soft sound of a blade being drawn, a breath before silence. No organization is flawless. Even the most disciplined assassins can fail. Even plans forged over years can collapse in a heartbeat. History rarely records failure because those who survive don't speak, and those who fail often leave no witness. Still, scattered across Islamic chronicles, crusader letters, and old folk tales, whispers remain of knives turned aside, of assassins captured at the final moment, of plots uncovered before they struck. But perhaps their most powerful weapon was never the dagger at all, it was patience. One of the most telling moments of failure, if it can even be called, that was the attempted assassination of Saladin, the revered Muslim leader who united Egypt and Syria and stood defiantly against the Crusaders. For years, he had waged war on the assassins, laying siege to their strongholds and demanding their eradication. But one night, deep inside his own encampment, a fiddle died as a servant slipped into his quarters. The blade was nearly drawn, yet fate intervened. A guard who had switched shifts unexpectedly caught the intruder at the edge of Saladin's bed. The fiddle was executed immediately. Saladin survived, but he was never the same. From that night onward, he slept only with guards stationed at his side. And more tellingly, he never again called for the annihilation of the assassin order. Instead, there was silence. Perhaps a letter passed hands. Perhaps a gesture, a tribute, or simply a mutual understanding between two forces who realized that neither could destroy the other. In that light, the fiddle had succeeded not by taking a life, but by delivering a message directly into the heart of one of the most powerful men alive. Another case, recorded in Damascus, concerned a prominent judge who regularly denounced the Ismailis in public sermons, urging their complete destruction. A fiddle infiltrated his inner circle, posing as a quiet student for months. On the appointed day, as he prepared to strike, he paused, not from fear, but from calculation. The judge was more heavily guarded than expected. He withdrew, leaving no trace. A rare decision, but not a failed one. Weeks later, another team arrived. This time, the mission was completed. That was the lesson. The assassins were not agents of passion or personal vendetta. They were instruments of discipline and patience. If a strike wasn't possible today, they would wait for tomorrow. Failure was not punished, it was studied. Each misstep became a map of the enemy's defenses, a pattern, code, and a terrain to learn. They didn't demand perfection, they demanded persistence. And sometimes, it wasn't the assassins who failed, it was the intended target who managed, narrowly, to survive. One such manner, cautious Lord, Word evaded death, not through strength, but sheer unpredictability. He changed his routines daily. No fixed meals, no regular bedchamber. He accepted food only from blood relatives. One day, he noticed a pilgrim trailing him for 4 days. He had the man seized. The moment the fiddle was captured, he bit into a capsule of poison sewn into his robe and died without a word. No one was killed, the day, but the impact was immense. Gates closed early, guards doubled, suspicion poisoned every shadow. The fear had been perfectly placed, and this was the assassin's true genius. Death was only one weapon. The anticipation of death was the real blade. Even a failed strike could plunge a kingdom into paranoia for years. A missed opportunity could scream louder than a successful kill. In 1256, the unthinkable finally happened. The Mongols, under Hulagu Khan, laid waste to Alamut. The stronghold that had withstood empires fell. A brutal, merciless incision into the heart of the order. But what the invaders found was nothing. No leaders captured, no grand libraries seized, no gold, no scrolls, no war council, only shattered walls, scorched stone, and symbols deliberately scratched from the rock, as if the inhabitants had erased themselves from time. It was as though the assassins had vanished just before the blade fell, protecting something more sacred than life, their legacy. Did they destroy themselves to deny their enemies the prize? Or did they simply melt back into the world they once haunted? No one knows. But after Alamete's fall, the assassin's name vanished from public life. No more messages, no more blades. The other fortresses were abandoned or repurposed. Survivors disappeared into the folds of ordinary life. And still, no one could say with certainty if they were truly gone, or merely silent. Some believe a handful survived and reformed in quieter, less visible ways. No longer an army or a sect, but something more elusive. A philosophy, a thread of belief passed from generation to generation. In remote mountain communities, they say, a few of the Fidei lived out their days not as killers, but as guides. Memory of secrets, a flame. Others whisper of assassins sent on missions who were never recalled. Not because they failed, but because no order ever came. They blended into distant cultures, faded into other religions, and became part of governments not to assassinate, but to protect a final secret. The reason why the order existed at all. From the 14th century onward, the name assassin ceased to be associated with a visible group, but something endured. In the northern hills of Iran, a peaceful branch of the Ismaili community still survives today. No weapons, no vengeance, just a careful, structured tradition or old texts, memorized and passed down. And one immutable rule: never let outsiders fully understand. And perhaps that is the secret of their survival. They didn't die, they evolved. When the world changed, they changed with it. When their name was erased, they took new names. When darkness was hunted, they learned how to walk in the light. No more strongholds, no more daggers. But the principles, essence remained. Perhaps the assassins truly are gone. Or perhaps they are watching, silent as always. And if they do still exist, their most powerful legacy isn't the bodies they left behind, but the terrifying idea they implanted in history that a stateless group, bound not by flags but by purpose, armed only with belief, could bend the arc of power across centuries. And even now, the word assassin still carries weight. Not because of blood, but because of what it means. History often forgets the defeated, the outnumbered, the heretics, and the footnotes not sanctioned by kings, or chronicled by churches. But sometimes, it is those who disappear from the official record who survive the longest. The assassins are one such legacy, not enshrined in textbooks, but remembered in stories, in symbols, and in the shared imagination of generations. After vanishing from the political world, they were reborn, not as a faction, but as an idea. From the 14th century onward, European historians and storytellers began to speak of them not as men, but as myths. Mysterious mountaintop sages, keepers of forbidden knowledge, minds in shadow. The word assassin spread. It became a symbol, a title, a warning, a curse. In Europe, it lost its religious roots and became shorthand for anyone who killed with purpose. And yet, the original shadow never left the killer with no fear, who moves for cause, not coin. In Old French and Latin manuscripts, the assassins are not crude murderers. They are whispered about as ghostly figures, philosophers, with blades, architects of invisible war. Marco Polo added to the myth, writing of false paradises filled with pleasure, where initiates were granted visions of the afterlife, then told they could return only if they died in service. Fact or fiction no longer matters. In the world of myth, uncertainty only sharpens the edge. The assassins entered poetry, theatre, and even theology. Heretics in one land, saints in another, always feared, never understood. Over time, the word assassin became untethered from its origin, evolving into a cultural icon. In novels, in cinema, and perhaps most famously in video games like Assassin's Creed, the idea lives on. Warriors of freedom standing against secret empires. A blend of fiction and truth, but the essence remains. A single individual, moving with conviction, can change the course of history. Maybe that's what draws us to them. Not the violence, but the clarity. Not the daggers, but the belief that in a world drowned in noise and surveillance, someone might still live unseen, protecting something precious. The assassin's true legacy isn't measured in death counts. It's a feeling, an idea that something is always happening just out of sight. That history has shadows, and in those shadows, someone still moves, still waits. And that is why we remember them. They were not remembered as an organization, but as a symbol proof of what human beings can do when they believe in something greater than themselves. No secret order survives for long without ritual, not just for communication, but to draw a sacred line between those who are inside and those who will always remain outside. For the assassin's ritual was not mere ceremony. It was a coded language, a system of initiation, a crucible for the soul. And perhaps the most haunting truth is this: nearly everything we know about them is speculation. To become a fidei, a devotee prepared to die for the mission, one did not merely swear an oath. The path was longer, darker, and almost mystical. Fragmented accounts describe initiates kept in isolation for days, even weeks. No books, no maps, only silence on the occasional cryptic sermon. The words may have been drawn from scripture, or perhaps from philosophy, or perhaps from something deeper still, a fusion of both. Nothing was written. Truth was never handed down, it was lived. Knowledge moved through gesture, parable, and symbol. Understanding wasn't taught, it ways absorbed through ritual, repetition, and reflection. In the assassin order, every carved stone, every folded paper, and every object deliberately misplaced held meaning. One tale tells of a fidei summoned, not by message or voice, but by a single olive branch tied with black thread left at his door. No word, no instruction, understood and vanished. That was their language, a speech made of silence. Even the very architecture of Alamat was designed like a riddle. Staircases twisted counter to expectation. Corridors led nowhere. Certain rooms were built so that a whisper in one chamber could be heard to floors below. To walk its halls was to read a language made of shadow and stone, a script only the initiated could decipher. Before a mission, The Fidei didn't merely depart. He performed his own rite. Some whispered an ancient verse, others kissed a carved talisman or lit a candle and extinguished it in utter silence. Each ritual was personal, but all pointed to the same truth. He did not act alone. He was an extension of something eternal. Even their speech was layered with hidden meaning. Greeting might be a command. A parable might encode a date, allocation, or a death. To outsiders, it was cryptic. To insiders, it was clarity. Over time, they developed a sacred language, never written down, never spoken though, and etched directly into the mind through practice. And repetition, once internalized, it needed no voice. A glance, a breath, a shift in tone, and the message was known. And when Alamat fell, those symbols did not vanish. They echoed. Traces of their system began to appear quietly in Middle Eastern architecture, in the marginalia of European manuscripts, and even in faded frescoes of remote monasteries. Were these echoes of a vanished order, or had the ideas simply slipped forward through time, passed quietly from one soul to another, needing no name? One thing is certain: no outsider ever fully cracked the code. No historian has recovered a complete ritual. And that is why the assassins were never truly unmasked, because they never wrote down what mattered. They lived it. They became it. And when they died, it was passed on not through words, but through presence, ritual rhythm, and remembrance. Because their rituals were not for concealment, they were for identity. They weren't hiding truth from the world, they were reminding themselves of who they were. That's why the order didn't crumble when their fortress fell, because their true fortress was within. To call them merely killers is to miss the most important truth. The assassins did not act like mercenaries. They moved with purpose, with spiritual conviction, with a terrifying calm born not from fanaticism, but from clarity. Their philosophy was rooted in the Ismaili tradition of Shia Islam, branch that believes divine truth is not always found on their surface, but in the hidden meanings beneath. To them, the Quran was not just a book of Lut, was a cipher, a mirror and a layered map toward higher understanding. Only those who awakened could read between its lines, and those who awakened believed they had a duty to restore balance in the world at any cost. Killing was never their goal. It was a corrective gesture, necessary incision to keep the body of the world from rotting. A tyrant, a demagogue, a corrupt judge, these were not just enemies, but diseased links in the chain of history. Their removal wasn't vengeance, it was medicine. Outsiders saw only death, but the assassins saw restored balance. Many Fidei needed no explicit order. They sensed the imbalance. They understood the logic. And they moved, silent, deliberate, as if they were not individual men, but cells within a greater mind that did not need to speak to act. Ancient fragments speak of Fidei meditating before their missions, not preparing to kill but reflecting, contemplating scripture, and invoking verses. They did not kill in rage. They killed with stillness, as though performing a sacred rite. And that is what terrified rulers most. The man who kills the king isn't dangerous because of his weapon. He is dangerous because he believes he is saving the world. And that belief wasn't born from blood, it was born in books. Because Alamat was never just a fortress. It was a university, a sanctuary of thought. Within its halls, they studied everything from Greek logic to Indian mathematics, from Babylonian star maps to banned religious texts. They didn't just learn to move unseen. They learned to see, to question, to think. They studied Aristotle, debated free will, and explored the ethics of power. They read heretical manuscripts and translated foreign texts, sometimes preserving ideas the world around them tried to burn. At Alamat, no one was discouraged from asking dangerous questions, and from this environment emerged something far more unsettling than a killer, a philosopher of action. Assassinations were not blind obedience. They were the outcome of a long moral debate. They believed that only by understanding the full weight of our life could one bear the responsibility of ending it. The most sacred space at Alamat was not the armory. It was the library. There, under the soft glow of oil lamps, manuscripts were read, copied, and protected. Islamic theology sat beside Jewish mysticism, Christian gospels beside Persian poetry, Egyptian medicine beside Greek cosmology. They preserved what others destroyed, not to hoard but to understand, because knowledge was their truest power, and for that they became enemies of kings and heretics to clerics. You could kill an assassin, but you could not kill an idea, a reinterpreted verse, a subversive question, an unanswered riddle. These were far more dangerous than blades, because while swords end lives, ideas endure. And in the end, perhaps that is the most lasting legacy of the assassins, not the deaths they caused, but the questions they forced the world to confront. If you see evil coming clearly, undeniably, and you have one chance to stop it, should you? The assassins never answered that question. They acted and left the answer behind as a silence in history that has never faded. Beneath the legends of poisoned daggers and of cloaked figures vanishing into mist, there lies a deeper truth. They were not defined by death. They were defined by thought. And the most dangerous thought of all was this, that justice, if abandoned by the world, may still be restored by those willing to sacrifice everything to bring it back, even their names, even their lives, even their place in history. Some questions outlive empires. The most dangerous fidei were not always killers. Some were dispatched not with blades, but with words. They traveled as scholars, cloaked in civility, gently unraveling belief systems with quiet, unanswerable questions. They didn't preach, nor did they incite. They planted seeds, subtle, disarming doubts that worked in silence, weakening foundations long before any blood was ever spilled. Most of Alamet's library, its true heart is gone, burned, buried, or scattered to the winds of history, and yet fragments still surface in European monasteries, in forgotten corners of ancient Syrian, Egyptian, and Persian archives. They carry no seal, no symbol of the Hashashin, but in their language, their precision of logic, and their haunting clarity, something unmistakable lingers, a presence, a signature, not written in ink, but in method. Yes, the assassins killed, but more than that, they asked why. They stayed awake through the night, not sharpening blades, but arguments. They studied not to justify violence, but to question whether killing could ever be justified at all. If anything truly sets them apart from every force of death in history, it is this: they believed intellect was not just a tool for living well, but the only way to die with honor. The assassin order may have disappeared from official history in the 13th century, buried beneath Mongol ruins and erased from maps. Yet the further they retreat into myth, the clearer their silhouette becomes. They exist now beyond physical space, no longer in fortresses or battlefields, but in symbols, in stories, and in the quiet pulse of the modern imagination. A presence we can't explain, yet somehow still feel. It was in the West during the 14th and 15th centuries that their image transformed. French, Italian, and Latin manuscripts began describing them not as heretics or criminals, but as shadow knights, enlightened warriors operating beyond the reach of law in service of a deeper truth. Their daggers became metaphors. Theirs is a kind of wisdom. They became protectors of what had been buried, the forgotten, the forbidden, the true. In the Enlightenment and through the Industrial Revolution, the assassin returned not in war, but in thought. As Europe questioned religion, defied monarchies, and challenged the legitimacy of power, the image of the assassin evolved again. Now they were not killers, but metaphors, voices for those without one, symbols of those who stood alone in the dark, not for glory, but for justice. Poets borrowed them, revolutionaries cited them. Philosophers found in their mystery a mirror for the solitary seeker, the rebel with ideals. The 20th century brought screens, and with them new life, films, novels, and television. Masked figures who lived in shadows, governed by inner codes, loyal to no flag but conscience. From V for Vendetta to The Matrix, from rogue agents to unseen hackers, each one echoed the old archetype, someone who resists a system, too large to confront directly, but too corrupt to leave alone. Their faces were new, but their essence remained. Then came Assassin's Creed, a game, yes, but also a portal. It reintroduced the assassin to a new generation. Fictional, yet rooted in fragments of truth, the game captured something real. The tension between freedom and control, identity and surveillance. Players didn't just wield blades. They stepped into the role of someone standing between two worlds, neither hero nor villain, but a force trying to reclaim something human, something lost. The message resonated. We are being watched, measured, and shaped, and we are quietly yearning to escape. Perhaps that's why the assassin never fades. When laws serve power, but not justice, when silence replaces truth, people remember them. The faceless ones in the dark. Not monsters, but sentinels. Not killers, but reminders. Off balance, of resistance, of a world once possible. Today, the assassination is not an event, not a group, not a name. They are a feeling, a signal in the mind. Someone is watching the watchers, not to kill, but to awaken. When modern historians tried to trace their trail, they quickly encountered something strange: silence. What we know of the assassins comes largely from those who feared them: Islamic chroniclers, crusader commanders, and travelers like Marco Polo. And in every account, myth and truth dance inseparably. The assassins left no official documents, no confessions, no testimony. Alamat's records vanished before the Mongols arrived, burned, hidden, or simply made to disappear. Symbols were chiseled off stone. Doors led to empty chambers. No plans, no manifestos, just absence. And yet it is that absence that continues to pull us in, as though the very lack of answers is itself a question. Archaeologists have combed the Alborz Mountains. They've found remnants, broken walls, old foundations, and pottery shards. But never the core, never mind the ideas. No manuals, no hierarchy, just scattered writings in poetic riddles, mystical prose, and cryptic metaphysics. Nothing to tie them directly to an organization, and yet, everything about them suggests a design, a hidden pattern, something encoded not in ink, but in intent. In the 19th and 20th centuries, some Western historians questioned whether the assassins were ever real. Were they simply a story inflated by medieval fear? A whisper turned to thunder by paranoid kings and ambitious clerics? But if they were just myths, why did so many empires take them seriously? Why did Crusader kings build thicker walls? Why did sultans negotiate with invisible enemies? And why did the Mongols send full armies to destroy strongholds most had never even seen? A ghost doesn't provoke that kind of panic. Only a truth hiding behind silence does. In the 21st century, efforts began anew. Cryptographers, linguists, and mathematicians all trying to decode the few fragments that remain. They found mathematical harmonies in Alamat's ruined design, logical structures in Ismaili poetry, recurring symbols that suggest a system meant to be read only by those initiated. Was this all coincidence? Or was it a code? A structure so carefully veiled that only the faithful could recognize it? Some believe the assassins didn't vanish, they dissolved. That pieces of them survived in Sufi mysticism, in the Knights Templar, and even in 18th century European secret societies. No definitive proof exists, but the overlaps, rituals, geometry, symbology invite questions. Did the assassins disappear? Or did they become the river beneath the surface, feeding other hidden traditions? Maybe the last question isn't whether they existed, but whether we truly want to know, or whether we are drawn to the mystery because it refuses to resolve. Maybe their greatest power wasn't in action, but in disappearance. Not in the blade, but in the silhouette that left no shadow. And now we live in a world so unlike theirs. No more stone fortresses, no more scrolls passed hand to hand. Ours is an age of satellites, artificial intelligence, biometric tracking, and invisible systems that know us better than we know ourselves. In this glass world, you might think there's no more room for those who choose to disappear. But strangely, it's in this world of algorithms and constant visibility that the assassin's shadow sharpens again. Because the more we're connected, the more we're watched. Every search, every click, every step leaves a trace. We don't live in cities anymore. We live in networks. And somewhere, deep inside, a thought begins to surface. I am not free. Here. The assassin returns, not in form, but in feeling. They are not about violence. They represent the right to vanish. The right to question without being profiled. The right to act beyond the reach of the system. Today, even small gestures echo their spirit. Turning off your phone, switching to privacy mode, encrypting a message, and covering a webcam. These are no longer quirks. They are instinct's residual traces of a forgotten code. A teenager lost in a glowing screen may not be just playing a game. He may be connecting to something the real world no longer allows the instinct to escape surveillance, to move silently, to choose. In fiction, in art, in encrypted whispers, the assassin remains with us not as a figure of death, but as a guardian of something older than law, the freedom to be unseen. And perhaps that is the final legacy, not the blade, not the blood, but the whisper that says, even now, it is still possible to be free. Today, scattered across the modern world, there are no official banners, no fortress strangholds, and no formal declarations. But if you look closely, you'll see them acts that feel familiar. Quiet gestures, anonymous messages, leaks that shake nations. They are the new signals of a silent rebellion. And in their rhythm, in their purpose, something ancient stirs. This is the resurrection of the assassin spirit, not as a group, but as a condition of the modern mind. No chain of command, no Hasani Sabah, just a lingering awareness that something must be protected, even if it can never be named. The modern world, wired and surveilled, may no longer permit an organization like the Assassins to exist in its original form. But ironically, this same world awakens the very instincts they once lived by. When someone uses a VPN to conceal their location, when a journalist encrypts their notes to avoid interception, when a coder uncovers state secrets and shares them with the world, not for fame, but for truth, they aren't calling themselves FIDI, but their actions echo the same code. Act in silence, not for self, but for principle. In that sense, the Assassins didn't vanish. They evolved. They dissolved into behavior, into reflexes, into thought. They became a response to the pressures of controller, way of thinking that arises whenever truth becomes too dangerous to speak aloud. Some believe we're alone in our fear of surveillance, in our mistrust of systems. But the truth is older. A part of us has always yearned for truth, while another part fears what that truth might cost. And in the quiet tension between those forces, we make decisions, subtle, private, often invisible, that mirror those made centuries ago by people in shadowed corridors. Not to kill, but to withhold, to resist exposure, to live with secrecy as a form of sovereignty. There may be no daggers drawn in the dark, but each time we question our privacy, each time we retreat from blind trust, each time we encrypt, evade, or refuse, the assassin spirit moves again. Historians often mark the fall of the Assassins as a clean break, an end. But if you examine how they operated, a different truth emerges. The Assassins was never structured like a conventional organization. They were a self-sustaining networker, fluid, decentralized, system-based, not on wealth, land, or status, but on philosophy. And that is why many modern scholars quietly suggest a far more radical idea. The Assassins never truly disappeared. They simply changed form. Like open source code, the mindset survives anywhere it is understood and replicated. It doesn't require leaders or buildings. It requires only this: act with purpose, in silence, not for the self, but for something larger. The system becomes too vast, too tight, too perfect. We no longer know where to look or who to ask, so we go silent. And in that silence, the Assassins emerge, not with answers, but with the courage to ask the question for us. They never told us what to believe. They never demanded action. They simply appeared, a blurred face, a silent strike, when all others stayed quiet. And when we look at them, what chills us isn't the dagger in their hand, but the haunting question: what did they see that made them act like this? The Assassins didn't inspire admiration in the traditional sense. No grand speeches, no monuments, no heroic anthems. But they made people afraid without being hated, curious but never bold enough to approach. And above all, they made people doubt themselves in the quiet of their own minds. That is power, a kind you cannot measure. We live in a modern world where justice is defined by law, but sometimes we all feel if that something's still off, still unsaid, still unresolved. And in that moment, we don't need a military. We don't need a revolution. We just need a single nod in the dark, someone who understands and moves at the right time. That's what the Assassins became, the embodiment of that exact moment. The one who speaks no words, but acts in the precise place at the precise hour. Not because they are good, but because they see what's slowly going wrong. And perhaps the most compelling thing of all, they never asked to be believed. They didn't preach. They didn't apologize. They didn't beg to be understood. They simply acted and disappeared. They left a cut, not just on flesh, bad key. Across the current of history, a single incision thin, silent, surgical, yet deep enough to make empires stop, look back, and fear again. They force us to ask, if someone is willing to kill to protect a truth we cannot see, ... what have we missed? And when that question echoes, we begin to re-examine everything we once thought certain. Can law be wrong? Can religion be abused? Can governments bend the truth? And if everything we know can be twisted, then what is left that is truly straight? We've walked together through the length of a story with no clear beginning and no real end, because the assassins were never meant to be a complete legend. They were an emptiness deliberately carved out by absence. In a world where every power wants to be seen, known, and praised, they chose to leave behind only a question. That question is not written on paper. It lives in the weary eyes of kings who once found daggers on their pillows. In the sudden change of a law, in the quiet death with no known cause. In the way an empire silently steps back not because it was defeated, but because it knew it was being watched. We may never know the full truth, and maybe we're not supposed to, because sometimes what matters isn't their story, but the feeling they leave behind in us. A feeling with no name, but one that makes us hesitate when we hear a voice that's too loud, see a power that's too quiet, or witness someone walking against the current. Not for fame, not for gain, but because they see something wrong. If the assassins left behind any true legacy, it wasn't the daggers, or the fortress, or the coded symbols. It was a human ability we all have, but few dare to use. The courage to stand alone, in silence, for what is right. And if that stirred something in you, if you find yourself still thinking, still searching for the missing pages of history, the truths that don't appear in textbooks, the people with no statues, who still change the course of entire eras in stay. Because this isn't the end, it's just a pause. So you can hit subscribe to Secret Historian, and when you're ready, we'll go deeper, quieter, and just as haunting. Thank you for listening, with your ears, with your patience, and with a heart that still dares to ask questions. If there's a story you'd like us to explore next to mystery still untold, leave a comment below. Sometimes the next journey begins with your question. Look at today's world. Human rights defenders who appear out of nowhere, expose atrocities, then vanish. Whistleblowers who disappear off the grid, risking everything to release truths buried under corporate lies. Anonymous groups with no leadership, no headquarters, and no rules yet powerful enough to shake governments. They work through encrypted channels. Their knowledge is distributed and compartmentalized. No one holds the full truth. Everyone is a fragment, just as it was in Alamut. And this leads us to a deeper hypothesis. The assassins no longer need to exist as a group. They now exist as a structure, a behavior, and a lineage of thought. In an age of surveillance, the best way to remain hidden is to blend in. They don't wear cloaks or live in mountaintops. They might be in chat rooms, masked behind anonymous usernames. They might be the scientist building better privacy tools, the coder fighting censorship, or the school teacher in a distant village who quietly plants ideas that unravel false narratives. They don't need to call themselves assassins. They never did. It takes only one person acting with conviction at the right time to carry the flame forward. No recognition, no history books, but the DNA of that way of thinking lives on. And perhaps you've already crossed their path. A message that changed your view. A post that made you question what you thought you knew. A gesture that lingered with meaning. Any of these could carry echoes of a tradition that has survived every purge, every empire, every rewriting of history. Not to kill but to protect. Something precious, the last piece of truth in a world drowning in noise. Power often carves symbols into history. Most fade when the empires that birthed them collapse. But very few survive because they do something different. They ask questions no one dares to answer. The assassins were born from paradox, to kill in order to preserve life, to vanish in order to reveal truth, to speak without ever being heard and still shake the world. In that paradox, they awakened something deeper than fear. They awakened doubt. Because every person, no matter their faith, flag, or ideology, carries, somewhere deep inside, a quiet suspicion. What if everything around me is built on the wrong foundation? And when that question rises, when systems become too loud, too controlling, too proud, a silence moves in the other direction. One that carries the discipline, the patience, and the moral clarity of a group that never needed to be seen to be feared.